Thank you. Thank you, Brett. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I apologize. I'm recovering. I have a slight cold, so if I sound weird, that's why. Also, I'm from the UK, so that's the other reason I sound weird. I'm wearing these just to be clear that I live in Tennessee now, but I'm originally from the UK. Go Vols. My youngest son is just about to graduate from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I say that crossing every finger I've got this summer. And so I just want to get the accent thing out of the way, but also in 2016, I became a citizen of this great country, and I want to thank you for having me. I love this country. And one of my proposals is that every kid should go to a ceremony before they graduate high school, just to get a sense. I think if you're born here, you don't realize what a privilege it is. And every year on the anniversary of becoming a citizen, I take out the letter from the president that reminds me, that welcomes me to the country and welcomes me to the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. I think you embody the responsibilities of citizenship. I said I was raised in the UK. Obviously, Rotary is an international organization. When I was 17, I was lucky enough to go on a leadership course that was entirely funded by our local Rotary. You can never know what it is in your life that's going to affect you, but I have incredibly strong memories of that 3-day course, and I think it changed how I saw myself, honestly. So I want to thank you on behalf of my 17-year-old self. My father has just stepped down as chair of the Rotary Club in Cardiff, in Wales. My mother's Welsh, and they've settled in Wales. So it's a little bit part of my life. The other thing I want to say is we've got a little bit less than an hour. I know it's a Saturday morning, and you're probably going to get those feedback forms on all the speakers. You know, how did we do? I'm sure you have some sort of way you can say how we all did. This is very nerve-wracking for us. In the old days, they used to do it physically. I'm sure now it's all online or probably AI. But I remember getting them once, and there was these little postcard-sized feedback forms, and on one of them it said, if I only had an hour left to live, I would choose to spend it listening to Richard Reeves speak. And then I realized it went on to the other side, and on the other side it said, because it would feel like a lifetime. See, people are funny. I actually have some sobering statistics to share with you. I'm going to talk to you as a scholar and as a father about what I see as a huge problem facing many of our boys and young men. And just to be clear, that's not instead of many of the challenges that we still face in our society facing women and girls. We don't have to choose between caring about those two different things. But I ended up leaving the Brookings Institution because I'd worked there for 10 years. I'd been in government in the UK, just because I kept running across some of the data points I'm about to share with you, which I just think make it clear that we're not imagining that many of our boys and men are struggling. They really are. So I'm just giving a fair warning that some of this is real, and some of it's quite sobering. Here's the book. Came out in 2022, which then led me down the path to doing something I didn't think I would do, is to create a new organization, the American Institute for Boys and Men. I couldn't get a publisher for this book originally because the whole issue was seen as too controversial. It took me a while. In the end, the Brookings Press published it. I'm very glad they did, and now I've created this new organization. We're small but growing, to research what's happening to boys and men, just to do straightforward research and policy in a very straightforward way. I think there's a lot of discussion of what's happening to boys and men, not enough facts. But I mentioned I'm a father. I have 3 boys. They're now 28, 24, and 23. I think that's right. It changes all the time, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And you can see them here. Cameron on the left, he's the senior at the University of Tennessee. George in the middle, who's 28 and runs a digital marketing company in the UK. Don't ask me what that is. Something to do with AI, probably. And then on the right is Bryce, who is my middle son. And so I've raised them in the UK and the US, dual citizens, of course. My wife's from Maryland. This is actually in North Wales, where my mother is from. My mother speaks Welsh as her first language. And behind them, in the mountain, that's a place called Blaenau Ffestiniog. is a slate mine. At one point, it was the biggest slate mine in the world, and every generation of my family worked in that slate mine until 2 generations ago, stretching back for at least 8 generations that we know about, and I wanted my boys to see that. And so we went down into the mine and got a sense of where they came from. It's actually an incredibly moving experience. And I will say that it's easy to sort of talk about the problems of other people's kids, and I don't want to suggest that my kids are the ones who've had the most trouble at all, but it's been a bumpy ride in some ways, and I especially say Bryce on the right, and I have his permission to talk about him. Bryce struggled through high school, only just graduated high school, to be honest. We got a call from the school one day to say, you know that Bryce hasn't been at school for 3 weeks. And we said, no, we did not know that. Could you have told us before? And they said, well, we've been emailing you, but it turns out that he'd asked his younger brother to get into our email accounts and auto-forward all the emails. That younger son is now the tech intern at my think tank. If you can't beat them, hire them. But so we didn't know. He struggled, made it through, took a year to figure it out, then ended up going to the UK, and he went to Cardiff University in Wales. And he went there because that's where my parents live. Also because it was 3,000 miles away from where his mum and dad lived. Sometimes 3,000 miles is what they need to put between you. But he also specifically went somewhere where he would live 2 miles from my parents. And I remember him saying to me once that when he was struggling to get to class, trying to stay motivated, he could look to the north, just 2 miles to the north, and see a tower, which was a tower of a hospital right by where my parents lived. And so he knew that tower was literally next door to where my parents were. And he said, and I know that if I need him, Grandpa will come. Sometimes it takes more than 1 generation to raise kids. And so he gets through college, does well, actually. And now he's a 5th grade teacher in Baltimore City, Maryland. Yeah. He's killing it, by the way. I did say to him, I said, you know you have to go when you're a teacher. But partly because he had some male teachers who probably got him through school at least, in social studies, and that's what he teaches now. So what goes around can come around. The other motivation of my work is, this is C.P. Scott, the founder of The Guardian. I worked at The Guardian for a few years. He said, this comment is free, but facts are sacred. And I hold that very dear to me, which is like, let's at least get the facts straight. We can then argue about what they mean or why, but we don't want a world where you can just choose your own facts. Right? I'm going to present facts today that are more about what's happening to boys and men, but I will stand behind them, and if they're wrong, I will change them. Right? I'm here to try and be authoritative. And the most important framing point before I get into the data is this is not a zero-sum game. Caring more about boys and men does not mean caring less about women and girls. There's still so much we need to do for women and girls in our society, not least in terms of leadership, access to capital, pay gap, etc. I have done so much work on those issues. And in fact, my wife obliges me to mention that only 3% of venture capital money goes to female founders because she's tried to raise money as a female entrepreneur. Right? So it's part of our marital contract now that I have to say that every time. So if she gets to hear a recording of this, job done. In other words, there are huge problems, but it doesn't mean there aren't also problems for our boys and men, and we don't have to choose between them. Brett doesn't have to choose between his son and his daughters. No one says if you've got sons and daughters, which ones are you going to care about? Which ones are you going to worry about? You're going to worry about both of them, and you're going to care about both of them. That's what I'm asking us to do. And I'm pleased to say that some people, and I put Governor Wes Moore, I was lucky enough to be with him yesterday, but also Spencer Cox in Utah and other governors are really stepping up into this space now. And I really like the way that Governor Moore put this, which is this is not a zero-sum game. We've got to lift up women and lift up boys and men. We've got to rise together. I think that's exactly the right attitude. Melinda French Gates was kind enough to select me as someone to become a philanthropist on her behalf to support gender equality. She picked out 12, embarrassingly called global leaders, which is a high bar, And we each got given $20 million of her money to spend on, in my case, projects on boys and men. And I'm looking at that email and I'm like, really? From Melinda French Gates? 20 million? I'm checking the URL, I'm assuming it's spam. Does the font change, halfway through? And I mean, it's real. And the reason is for that, because of this. Because she says we need boys and men to do well if we want women and girls to do well. We don't have to choose. It's not zero sum. Right? She is a strong advocate for women's rights. But she has come to realize that actually we all need to do better. So I'm just going to give some data points, just a couple of data points on each of these main sections, and then I'm going to make sure we have a little bit of time for some questions and challenges. And if I don't get questions, then I will have failed, because this is a difficult conversation to have right now. I'm going to start with mental health and spend a bit more time on this, because I know this has been a huge issue for you, especially for Brett. And I'm going to share some statistics that include suicide deaths and drug poisoning deaths, just so that everyone's aware of what's coming. You may well have heard about the mental health crisis that's playing out among young people. It's true. I think that word crisis is overused, but in this case, I think it's fair enough. This chart shows you what's happened to suicide rates among women of these different ages between 1999 and 2022. The numbers didn't change much after that. And what you can see is that suicide rates rose for all of those groups of women. Right? Pretty unusual to have rising suicide rates in the world right now. But the US does. So that's the story for women, and here's the story for boys and men. It's 4 times higher, it has risen very rapidly indeed. And we're now losing in the US 40,000 men a year to death from suicide. Which, to put it in context, that's the same as the number of women we lose to breast cancer. But obviously very different problems, I'm not comparing them in that sense, but just to give you a sense of the scale, 40,000 men a year. 4 times as many men. And something's changed. This shows you the change in suicide rates up till 2010, for the 10 years up to 2010, by age. It's just for men now. And what you can see is huge rises in this late middle age group, so 45 up to 55 and into early 60s. So you can see that just what was happening to the economy, more generally, a lot of rural areas, but also the Midwest, etc. And it was particularly working class men. We lost a lot up to 2010. But after 2010, from 2010, something's changed. So the next bars I'm going to show you are what's happened, same age groups, since 2010. You can see on the right there's a bit of balancing out, but focus on the left. Those orange bars, that's young men. So since 2010, basically all the rise in suicide has been among young men. And we don't really know why. We have a story about what happened to middle-aged men. We don't really know why. This shows you I promise you that not everything I'm sharing is quite as gloomy, but I do think it's important that we're honest about the scale of the crisis. This shows you the causes of death since 2001, again for men. And you can see then we go through homicide, car crashes, and then that rising suicide rate up there. But on top of that is something even more important, which I know, again, a lot of the civic work you do, and I think is a huge issue, and I'm sure you find it in your community, certainly we see it in my community, which is around drug deaths, drug poisoning deaths. This is what's happened to drug poisoning deaths among men since 2001. So that increase that you can see there in that top line is the increase in, this is relatively new work that we've done, the increase in the number of men we're losing to drug poisoning, not from suicide, this is not intentional, but from poison. That rise, you can see that rise, means that over the course of those 20 years or so, since 2001, we've lost an additional 400,000 men in the US. 400,000 additional deaths. 400,000 is the number of men that we lost in World War II from the US. So we have lost the equivalent of a world war in terms of male deaths since 2001 from the increase in drug poisoning. I don't think those are numbers you can ignore. And this is almost entirely driven by men, these male deaths. So there's a mental health crisis playing out differently for boys and men than there is for women and girls. I'm not saying it's necessarily worse, We see different data for depression rates, etc., anxiety, especially among teen girls, social media. But we're also seeing this, right? And I'll say a little bit here just about the importance of civic institutions. I know you're interested in Robert Putnam's work and others, and the role of connection for many men. In both directions, I've come to realize that the power of civic engagement and mentoring is at least as much, I think, for the person providing the mentoring and the coaching as it is for the person receiving it. And we have a crisis of civic engagement right now, especially among men. Every big brothers, big sisters in the US has a longer waiting list for boys than for girls because they don't have enough male volunteers. I know you're doing a blood drive here. That's great. For the first time ever, actually, women are more likely to give blood in the US now than men, despite the fact that women actually can't give blood if they're premenopausal for big chunks of the month. So that's weird. Scout leaders, etc. And then all the work you're doing makes even more important. We need a call to men. We need men in the lives of boys. Fathers, yes, and I'll get to that, but teachers like my son, mentors, coaches, neighbors, uncles. Boys don't become men just with the passage of time. We need help. And the people that most importantly give that help are the men. The guy at the front of the classroom, the guy on the coach's bench, the guy in the neighborhood, the guy in the Rotary. And right now we have a bigger crisis of civic engagement among men than we do among women. Some of you might probably heard there's a big gap in education now, so I'll do this quite quickly. Back in 71, 72, we saw that there was a gap in favor of men. So if the bar is above the line, it shows you the gap in favor of men in getting a college degree. This is 4-year college degrees. Men were about 13 percentage points more likely to get a college degree than women in the early 70s. Women caught up, overtook, and this is where we are now. There's a bigger gender gap on college campuses today than there was in the 1970s, but it's the other way round. Men are further behind women today in education than women were behind men. That was a problem in the 1970s, and thank God we addressed it. But I think it's also a problem if men have now fallen even further behind women than women were behind men when we passed Title IX. Why is that? Well, it largely reflects what happens in high school. And Brett's already mentioned some of the data here from Anecdote, but I'll just add some GPA data. This is the bottom 10% of the high schoolers by GPA. 2/3 of the kids graduating high school with the lowest GPAs are boys. That's the dark green. There are twice as many boys at the bottom as there are girls. This is the rest of the distribution. Look to the right, on the far right, that's the top 10%, 2/3 girls. So there are twice as many girls at the top of the class as boys coming out of high school. Again, amazing that girls are doing so well, having been held back for so long. But it's a problem if boys are falling so far behind. The question then is, why that? Why do we see this huge GPA gap, especially there at the top? Because there isn't a gap on SAT. This is the data for the standardized assessment tests. It's the same for ACT. I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about with the SAT, especially if you've got kids. If anything, there's a little bit of an overrepresentation of boys at the top there. A little bit, it's 57%, but also at the bottom. And overall, there's not much of a gap. And that's all explained by math. So I'm going to ask you a question. Why do you think that there's no gap on SAT and tests between girls and boys, but there's a massive gap in GPA in the grades they're getting in school? What do you think? Just shout it out. Sorry? They do. Even in states where everyone takes the test, it's exactly the same gap. Maturity. You like it, yes. Motivation.
More math and science on SAT will get boys generally are favored by female teachers to teach those.
The boys do a bit better on the math bit of the SAT. That's the only reason you see that gap. Boys do a bit better on math generally, but only on tests. Girls are ahead on math GPA. Apathy? Wow, tough crowd. Not cool to make good grades, but is it cool to get a good SAT score?
Nobody sees that.
No role models. Well, I think that's part of it. I think if you start to see school as like not a thing that boys are supposed to be good at, or the teachers are female, the girls are doing better, etc. It sort of codes as a bit more of a female endeavor, maybe, for sure. But I think that the maturity point is really what's going on here. So I'm going to show you some data for the development of boys and girls. What this shows you, from the ages 10 on the left to about 25 on the right, the development for girls of something called impulse control. Impulse control is like the brake on the car, right? So it stops you from doing the thing you might want to do. And then this is sensation seeking, which is like the gas in the car. This is like the, let's go for it. So sensation seeking, the orange line, that's the bit of your brain that's saying to you, when your friend says, let's skip school tomorrow, drive to Delaware and try that new drug, it's like, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And the green line, the impulse control line, is saying, maybe that's not a good idea. I've got a test tomorrow. I'm going to get in trouble, and I definitely shouldn't take a drug. Right. All of life is about the balance between those two, right? If we only ever did the right thing, if we're all brake, we'd never get anywhere. Life would be quite dull. But if we're all sensation-seeking, life would be fun, but probably quite short. And as you can see, that in these teenage years, where those lines basically slightly cross, that's when impulse control is at its lowest and sensation-seeking is at its highest. You're a teenager, so this chart is just a very, very boring way of telling you what you already know, which is that the teenage years are a hot mess. And then things get better, right? That's girls. Now I'm going to show you the same lines on the same axis for boys. This is boys' impulse control, and this is boys' sensation seeking. Okay, now this has all kinds of implications for behavior, risk-taking, etc., but it also has huge implications in the classroom, because the gap between impulse control and sensation seeking is the gap between turning your homework in, doing your homework, and turning it in, and not. It's about maturity, but not in an eye-rolly sense, just in a genuine brain development sense, is that a 15-year-old or 14-year-old boy is younger than a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old girl. If you don't believe me, go into a classroom, go into a 9th grade classroom, an 8th grade classroom, and just ask the boys and girls to open up their book bags. Have a look. Again, on average, the girls' book bags will be reasonably organized, good binders, maybe with sticky labels, etc. And the boys' book bags will be like a controlled explosion. Right? But it just takes us a bit longer to get the frontal cortex, which is this bit here, which comes largely, is triggered by puberty, and boys hit puberty a year or two later. That bit of the brain, turn your chemistry homework in, right? That's a very quick summary of decades of neuroscience, but that's the basic point. And it's affecting GPA, but not SAT, because it doesn't mean you're less smart. It just means that you're less organized, less future-oriented. You're just struggling more. And the education system is failing to recognize that. And too often our education system, I'm sorry to say, ends up treating our boys like malfunctioning girls. Right? Why can't you sit still and pay attention and turn your homework in and organize your book bag? Why aren't you more like your sister? Is the question that many parents ask themselves on a daily basis. I used to ask myself about my sons, why aren't you more like your sister? And they didn't have a sister. I made one up to compare them to. This shows you just the decline in the share of teachers that are male. In the 80s, it was 33% of our teachers were male. Now it's 23% and falling. So thank you for your scholarship. I'm proud of my son. We're doing our bit. We just need about 500,000 to 1 million more men to get into our classrooms. And it's particularly true for certain racial groups. This just shows you the ratio between kids' gender and race and their teachers. And you can see that for girls, there's a 5-to-1 ratio for white girls, up to 16-to-1 for Hispanic, and then you can see the story for boys. So especially male teachers of color are almost non-existent in our K-12 schools, but male teachers generally. And I'm going to say a couple of things just about the economy. This shows you some really good news. Non-working class women is just a way of saying they have a BA. So in these charts, non-working class, we define working class as not having a college degree. We could get into that. This just shows you the rise in wages for women with a college degree. This shows you the rise in wages for men with a college degree. And here you can see that the gap hasn't really closed at all. So the gender pay gap is real, but you can also see big rise in earnings. This is the small rise in earnings for women without a college degree, but it is a rise, and this is what's happened to male wages for those without a college degree. Men without a college degree earn the same today as men without a college degree did in the 1970s. There's not been a pay rise for those men for half a century. That's a problem for all kinds of reasons I can get into. And I've mentioned the lack of male teachers. One other thing on this, which is that also the mental health professions themselves that serve the people who most need help have also become female professions, and they did not used to be. This is the share of men, the share of a profession that was male in the 1970s. So 68% of psychologists were male in 1970, and 38% of social workers were female. So not half, but close to parity. This is what's happened since. So we are emptying the men out of our classrooms, and we are emptying the men out of our mental health professions, and then we wonder why we see these problems down the line. I think these are as big a problems as the lack of women in areas like science and engineering and law, and we should continue to work for more female representation in those professions and for more male representation in these professions. I respectfully put it to you that if this line was showing you that these professions were becoming all male professions, you would be reading about it in your newspapers. But I think it is just as big a problem if we don't have any men who are counselors, psychologists, social workers too. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about family and fatherhood. You might have heard worries about marriage gap and fatherlessness, and that is a huge issue, but it's a class issue. This shows you the marriage rates for women with a college degree and without a college degree by their birth year. Green is those with a college degree, orange those without a college degree. As you can see, go back in time, basically your chances of getting married not affected by your level of education at all. Your chances of getting married if you've got a college degree are very similar today than they were decades ago, and they have cratered for those without a college degree. There is a massive class gap in marriage now, which means a massive class gap in access to fathers, and therefore an increasing importance of male role models elsewhere in life. Another way to put this is to look at the share of kids born outside marriage. This shows you the share of kids born outside marriage for women with a college degree. It's doubled from 5% in 1990 to 11% today, 2019. It's doubled, but it's still pretty low. This is for everybody else. 40% of kids are born outside marriage now in the US, and more than 50% of the kids born to mothers without a college degree are born outside marriage. Why does that matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. It matters because all too often, if there's no marriage or the relationship between the parents breaks down, it means that the kids lose touch with their father. And for a pretty high proportion of those kids, they lose the relationship altogether. Within about 6 years, about 30% of kids have lost all relationship with their father if their parents separate. And so what this means is a gap in fatherhood. I'm going to end on a bit of a positive note and then take some questions. At least I hope positive. Here are some solutions that I've been working on. If you don't like them, as Groucho Marx said of his principles, here are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. I have other policy ideas too. But here's some ideas. I think boys could start school a bit later. They mature later. Let's redshirt them. Give them a few months more to mature. We desperately need more technical high schools. Vocational training, vocational learning, all of that is just a bit more boy-friendly than girl-friendly. The evidence is very strong on that. That also means we need more apprenticeships. If we can't get more apprenticeships, I don't know what we're going to do with a lot of these young men. We need a massive recruitment drive of male teachers. Like if 33% was what we had in the 80s, why couldn't we not get back to that today? I just don't think it's good enough if we just see every year the share of male teachers going down and no one doing anything about it. Either we think representation matters or we don't. But if we do, then we are close to a crisis point where the teaching profession is becoming seen as a female profession. That was not always the case. I think every college campus, I know there's some college people in the room, should have a men's resource center and a women's resource center. We should have both. I want more scholarships to get men into education as well as into these health areas. Just as we have scholarships for women into STEM, let's have more for men into what I call HEAL jobs, health, education, literacy. I think fathers should get paid leave. The US military now gives 3 months to dads and 3 months to mums. Hallelujah. I think civilians should get something similar. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and invite your questions and comments. Thank you. Great. Thank you, Olivia.
Yes.
There, we have a microphone down here, so please just shout for the mic. And please, if there's a provocative question, please ask it, because I know this is...
Thank you very much. I did very much enjoy your facts.
Thank you.
They were eye-opening. Your first, mental health, you showed automobile accidents, and I was wondering why you included that under mental health. Is that a mental health issue? And why was that statistic on that
No,
graph?
so that was just a general causes of death chart. And so there was also a big category which was just other. And the reason I showed that was to show that actually there's a lot of stability, not much change. If anything, a slight reduction in motor vehicle deaths for men, because cars have gotten safer, by and large. And to show you where the real changes were, which was in suicide and drug poisoning. And so it's really just by way of comparison. So if you're worried about what's going to take the life of a man, you should be much more worried now about a drug overdose than a car accident. I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about both, but as a risk factor, it is now just an order of magnitude more likely that they will die of a drug overdose than that they will die in a car crash. It is not to get complacent about car crashes. It is simply to say that I think sometimes we don't update our view of the risks in line with the data.
Thank you for your talk. I grew up with 5 brothers, 3 sisters, a very active father, but a very important part of my boyhood, I guess, young adulthood, was the Boy Scouts. And I just feel like institutions like that have just sold out some ways, and I'm saddened by, I think maybe you can talk about that.
You say they've sold out?
Yeah, I think it's kind of tried to be something for everybody because I don't know if it's money or something, but I don't know if it's lost some of its values that they taught.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm working with Robert Putnam right now on there was a boy crisis 100 years ago, beginning of the 20th century, moving into the cities, boys roaming around. There's lots of headlines about the boy crisis in America's cities. And very, very quickly after that, a whole bunch of institutions were created. YMCA, Big Brothers, boys clubs, and we brought Scouts, obviously from the UK originally, to the US. And so there was this civic response of creating all these civic institutions and organizations to work with boys and young men. And I think you could argue they were pretty successful. Every single one of those now has either declined or gone co-ed. So Boy Scouts of America does not exist anymore. It's Scouting for America, yeah. Because they've gone co-ed. Girl Scouts remains Girl Scouts and a single-sex organization. Boy Scouts has become Scouting for America and has gone co-ed. Now, not every troop has to go co-ed. Speaking at the annual conference, Scouting for America this year, I am very critical of that decision. I understand it, but I think it's a terrible mistake. I think we need some spaces in our communities, where girls and young women can be with other girls and young women to learn certain skills, certain ways of being in the world. And actually, the Girl Scouts work a lot on STEM and leadership and all of that stuff, which I think is a little bit easier for the girls to do when the boys aren't around. And the Boy Scouts can work on teamwork and relational skills and resilience and all of that, which is a bit easier to do when there aren't girls around, right? But the idea of single-sex institutions for boys has become a bit problematic in contemporary culture, and I think that is a profound mistake. I think we'll look back and say, what were we doing to take away all of the spaces that used to exist just for boys? It makes sport and coaching even more important, though, but boys' participation in sports is declining as well. Why? Well, one reason why, the schools don't have enough coaches for boys' sports anymore. Why? Because guess who make up a lot of the coaches in schools? The male teachers. My son was a soccer coach within 5 minutes of walking into his school in Baltimore. All he did was say, "Good morning," and they went, "Soccer coach." About a third of male teachers are also coaches. God bless them. And so every male teacher we lose a bit of a coach. We need something like a Coach for America program, honestly, in that space. But we also we've got to have those civic institutions just for boys. I was a Boy Scout and a Scout leader, and I just think something's gone wrong when we think there's a problem with Boy Scouts. There is something wrong with the old boys club, with men, just tucking themselves off to have port while the women clean the dishes, or whatever year we want to refer it to, and then just give each other work, right, and promotions. That was a problem. But Boy Scouts is not a problem. 12-year-old boys are not giving each other venture capital. Yes, more questions.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Richard, for your speech. I enjoyed the statistics you shared, but two questions. One is you didn't share any international or worldwide. We as a Rotary, we're worldwide. Is the same statistics that we have here worldwide? We share it worldwide. That's one. Second questions. You didn't talk anything about sports and the impact and pressures of sports and people get in sports, especially men, the impacts of the younger people.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. So the first question is about international trends. Many of these trends are the same in all advanced economies. So the education gaps, for example, like every advanced economy in the world, the men and the boys are behind the women and girls. It's true across most of the Middle East now as well. Certainly true in Scandinavia and Western Europe. The gaps are actually a little bit bigger in Scandinavia. There's a 20-point gap in college going. It's one of the reasons the Norwegian government created a commission on boys and men. The mental health issues are a little bit different. I'm pleased to say that the suicide rate is not rising in most countries. In fact, it's going down in a lot of Western European countries, and it's flat in the UK. The gender gap is the same everywhere, though. So there's always about a 4 times higher risk of suicide for men than for women, even at lower rates. And the wage trends are similar in other countries, but not quite as bad for lower income men in other countries as in the US. Working class men in the US have been hit peculiarly hard. That line I showed with flat wages, it's not flat in the UK, it's a little bit better than flat. But I would say that the broad issues, the changes that have happened in our economy and our society have raised a question around what it means to be a man, how to become a man, how to be, productive and a man of service. I think the questions are similar, and I'm pleased to say we're launching a UK version, a UK research organisation next year, talking about some Scandinavian ones too. On sports, we just published a paper on sports showing the decline in sports participation among young men continues to rise for young women slowly, but the gap hasn't closed yet, and it's a really good example of being able to think 2 thoughts at once. It's a problem that young women still don't play as much sport as men, probably. I'm a bit less convinced of that than I was, actually, because the young women are also, they're doing a lot of other stuff. They're doing the extracurriculars, they're doing theatre, they're doing dance, they're doing music, etc. Sports is the only extracurricular activity that boys are still doing a little bit more than girls, and the gap is closing. So the Aspen Institute say that it was a 15-point gap 10 years ago, it's a 5-point gap now. It's probably going to close in the next few years. Is it a problem that maybe girls aren't playing as much sport as boys? Yeah, I think it probably still is. Is it a problem that we're closing the gap between them by reducing the number of boys playing sport? Yes. Why? I mentioned coaches. Sometimes there are financial barriers. Obviously, there are alternatives now. I think the attractions of video gaming, very different to how it was 20 years ago. We have to be realistic about that. There are different alternatives to it. But I think it's a problem. And I think sports, and especially team sports, are really good. And I think one of the problems of the US, if I can say this as a new citizen, is that the competitive nature of US sport, particularly for young people, is a mixed blessing. On the one hand, amazing how good people get. On the other hand, there's a lot of a sense of unless you're really good, you can't play sport. Whereas where I grew up in the UK, well, you could be terrible. I played every sport imaginable, and I sucked at all of them. And I never let that stop me. If I had let the fact that I sucked at a sport stop me playing it, I wouldn't have played anything. I'm a terrible athlete. But my God, I had a good time and learned team sports, etc. And I think sometimes the pursuit of excellence in the US has become a problem. And I will also just say, at the risk of upsetting people, that travel sports, travel teams, are the work of the devil. Just ban them. Yes?
In staying on the same vein, what do you think should be done about social media in terms of the bullying that goes on daily and its effect on teen suicide?
I recommend strongly the work of Jonathan Haidt. I mean, good chance you've all heard of him. He has a book, The Anxious Generation, which has been on the bestseller list since it came out a year ago. And he's a good friend of mine, so I say that with some bitterness. But he's chair of our advisory council, and he has a very good chapter on boys and men. So I think that getting the phones out of schools, God bless him. I mean, he's just winning that argument, nationally and internationally. Amazing. Social age verification, sure. What I will say, though, is that the technological shock is playing out a bit differently for women and men, or for boys and girls. For girls, the very social aspect of the media is what makes it so dangerous, because you get relational bullying online, and also you get body image issues if you're constantly, you sort of just saw the video, was it Scott who spoke before me? I've forgotten his name. Of the girls, right? Yes, Steve, I'm sorry. Steve showing the girls. And so because it's very visual and very social, it plays into some real vulnerabilities that are particularly found in girls, which is body image issues leading to all kinds of issues around eating disorders, etc., and relational bullying. You know, the mean girls phenomenon is real, and it's now gone online. Girls bully as much as boys do. It's just they do it relationally rather than physically. You know, it's like ostracism, best friends, mean, etc. Boys are more likely to do it physically. So what that means is that the very social nature of it is affecting teen girls' mental health quite badly, and it's causing issues around anxiety and depression and body image. With boys, it's a little bit different. With boys, it's actually more about gaming. They're less likely to be on social media in that sense, and I think it's more isolating. I think the problem with boys is that actually the attractions of the online world, and to some extent some of the YouTube stuff, is that it pulls them away from interaction. Not always, gaming can be interactive too. And so I think that it's very important we understand that the way that technology is playing out is a bit different for women and girls. And so to put a sharp point on it, I think if you've got a daughter, you should really worry about what kinds of media she's consuming online. And if you have a boy, you should worry more about just how long he's online, because it's more what he's not doing. It's more that it displaces other activities rather than it's directly harmful. I think social media is more directly harmful to girls than it is to boys. The effect on boys is that they're doing that rather than being out climbing trees or playing soccer or whatever.
Here, I am a woman,
Okay.
a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a retired professional, and I have to respond to something you said several minutes ago. When you were talking about the Scouts, and you said that you felt that essentially boys and men need to have a space for themselves. And I have to tell you, I won't say this is the last time I've heard this, but I heard it and it made a big impression on me, and it's over 30 years ago. And a woman whose husband was in Rotary, who knew I'd been invited as a guest, basically said, I don't think they should have women in Rotary.
Your husband said that?
No, a wife of a man who was in Rotary.
Okay.
The wife said, I don't think they should have women in Rotary because the men need a place to themselves. Now, my response to that was, when they asked me to join Rotary, I said, you bet, because I didn't agree. And I will stand here and say to all of you that what I have seen in over 30 years in Rotary, and this is no disparagement of Brett and many other men, but one reason that Rotary is still as vibrant as we can make it here in the US is because of all the women who have gotten involved. And I'm not going to go into causation or what that means to the men, but I just wanted to get that point out here in this total discussion. Thank you.
Right. Well, I'm glad you said that. So I hope you didn't hear me saying I thought that the Rotary had made a mistake by admitting women. No. Okay. And I think that there's a couple of things there. Like, so I'll say one thing that I think is probably less controversial than the second thing I'm going to say in response to your comment. The first thing is I'm very clear about this distinction between an adult professional organization, right, of any kind, where I think that the risks and downsides of those being separated by sex is pretty clear. I'm very interested, though, that there's now one of the fastest growing networking organizations in the US is called Chief. It has 10,000 women in it. It only allows women. It has clubs in cities all around the country. It costs about $8,000 a year to be a member. They do mentoring, coaching, etc., and it's no men allowed. I have mixed feelings about that, and I don't know what people will think about that, but it's interesting, and a lot of the women in my life, my wife included, who's pretty strong feminist, if I can still use that word, she has mixed feelings about it, right? But in general, I think that there's a big difference between something like this, and I agree about the women's energy, and something like Girl Scouts. I don't think Girl Scouts should go co-ed and let boys in. I think there's something quite good about there being a space for girls, particularly as they're developing and becoming women and figuring that out, and to have some space where they can just do that as girls and women. I just think the same is also true of boys and men growing up. So I think the difference between the youth, and I think what's happened is that the correct instinct about excluding women from this kind of organization has spilled over into a general suspicion of all male spaces, regardless of the age of the people involved. So I think that what we've said is, well, Rotary's gone co-ed, so obviously Boy Scouts needs to go co-ed. And I think that's a false move. I don't think the first leads to the second. And I think as a result, we have lost. I mean, there are basically almost no male youth spaces left, but we have kept the female ones. And again, I'm kind of here for that. The second thing I will say, though, is that this is it's a bit more controversial. I have noticed that sometimes men, and this is probably a knock on men actually, is that sometimes I think they need a specific call to them to come and do something like a men's group through church or something like that. And if it's just completely co-ed and we just say everyone's the same, I've noticed that women are more likely to step up into those roles than men, right? And then they're like, why are we doing all the work? And I think that can become a bit of an eye roll kind of moment, which is like, well, men are lazy, they don't try, kind of, etc. And I think there's something else going on here too, which is like a little bit of, I think this is a hard truth, but I think there's something to also sending a signal to men and to women that we need them to show up as men and as women sometimes. Most of the time it doesn't matter. But some of these coaching things, like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, for example, they match. I've just signed up to be a big. They match men to boys and women to girls. And so there, the fact that it's a 12-month waiting list, where I live in East Tennessee for boys, but a 2-month waiting list at most for girls, is a problem. And the cause of that is they have lots of female volunteers to be bigs and not enough men. And so sometimes I think we've got to be open about saying, guys, we need you to come do this thing, specifically. And we also want women to come do these things too. But my basic point is, I think that's, let's see what the Scouting for America say to me when I make this point from the stage or their annual conference, which is, you just made a terrible historic mistake.
Well,
and good for them for inviting me, by the way. Good for them. I'm also, good for them for inviting me, because my views on this are not private. So.
Well, thank you, Richard, for such an engaging conversation. I know we had a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to in this session, but he will be around to
Sure.
ask
Yeah.
to discuss some of those questions. I guess I do want to just wrap it up with an additional question. You were presenting this to a professional organization, mixed men and women. When you present this information, or do you, to the boys of this age, what is the response in the trends that they're seeing at that level?
Well, it depends how honest they feel. It depends how honest they feel they can be. What I have noticed is that quite often, to get boys and young men to talk honestly about some of the challenges they're facing and some of the mixed messages they're getting about masculinity and about men from women and men and online, etc., I have to kick the adults out of the room. If I go into a high school and I want to have a conversation, an honest conversation with boys and young men, I have to get the teachers out. And I have to get the parents out. Because they know what they're not supposed to say. They know what they're not supposed to think in front of the adults. They know what they're supposed to say and think. And so they perform. And then I kick the teachers out and I say, what's your favorite Andrew Tate video? For those who don't know who Andrew Tate is, he is one of the most powerful people in the world. Online, pretty misogynist influencer. But every man under the age of 30 has engaged with Andrew Tate's content, one way or the other. And all of them have a favorite Andrew Tate video, but they're not even going to admit to having watched Andrew Tate if their teacher or their mum is in the room. That would be like admitting that they've watched hardcore pornography or something. Almost as bad as that. Because they know how vilified Andrew Tate is for very good reason, and they know what the response they're going to get from the powers that be. And so we're not creating spaces for boys to have honest conversations. And so I've noticed a big, big difference, because the trouble is that right now, a lot of boys and young men, especially if they don't have fathers and coaches in their lives, they go online. Or they just ask and on Tuesday, they're being told that their problem is that they're too masculine and they should stop being so toxic. And their problem is that they're not vulnerable enough and they should cry more. And then they're told on Wednesday that the problem is that they're not man enough and they should man up and be more stoical and take a cold plunge every day. And that's what women really want, is an alpha male. And by Thursday, they have no idea how to be. And I think what's happened is we have failed as a society to promote a script, a story about pro-social, civically engaged masculinity and what it means to be a good man. And as a result, because we're worried that will come across as somehow anti-women and that we're somehow negating the role of women. And our failure to do that has left many of our boys and young men in search for an answer to the question, how should I be? They know what not to do. They know how not to be, and that's good, but they don't know how to be anymore. And that vacuum has created, there's a lovely line from Richard Rohr, the theologian. He says, into a vacuum, demons always pour. And I think the cultural vacuum around men and boys and masculinity, because of some of the real concerns about talking about it, that vacuum has been filled by demons online. And so if we want our boys and young men to have a better conversation about it, we have to have it with them, rather than let them have it online. I want the angels in the vacuum, not the demons. Thank you for the question.